Nemo, you're wonderful. Morning. So on our soul trek last month, we went to the edge. We encouraged each other to go to the edge. And so this month, I'm going to invite you to take a leap. When I think of images of leaping, for me, I think of dancers. I think of how dancers leap across the stage, particularly ballerinas. And when I lived in Reno, I had a neighbor who was a ballerina, and she would give me tickets once in a while so I could go see her, and I was amazed how she would just fly across the stage. And it got to the point where when she would leave her house in the morning to take out the garbage, I fully expected her to leap out the front door and leap over to the garbage and leap back in. And she never did. You know, she always had like a babushka, and she'd always come walking out like this. And they were very contrasting images. So this leaping is the idea that we make a big jump, whether it be in consciousness or physically or all the different ways that we can do that. And a leap is when we start in one place, we end up in another, and then we look back and we go, how did I get there? Do you ever have that happen in your life? All of a sudden you turn around and you're like, wow, I've come a long way. I don't even know how that happened. And the truth is that a leap happens and starts with 1,000 tiny steps. 1,000 tiny steps. A leap also takes a certain amount of faith and commitment. So last month we were on the edge, right? And the edge means that we are willing to move beyond our comfort zone, so we challenged each other to do that. And we set up a couple of experiences in the church. One is through the Nia dance, because that's an edge for some people. Another is by singing karaoke. That's another edge. And then a group of us, about 44 of us, went ziplining last Sunday. Zipliners, let me hear from you. And we found that it was actually quite fun. It was a lot of fun. In fact, I'll probably show you some clips, but maybe in the next couple of weeks. And one of the things that was interesting about the zip line, and by the way, my group kept making me go first all the time, is that, you're hooked up to all this, each zip line became, until we were like pros at the end. We were like zip line masters. But we found out that it actually was pretty easy and that it was fun. So when we're on the edge, what the edge calls for is for us to go beyond our comfort zone, to reach a place of what can be called optimum anxiety. Now, we're not talking high anxiety here. We're talking optimum anxiety. Because what happens is when we get too comfortable, we tend to phone it in. It's like, yeah, I'll do that. I'll take care of that. But when we're, a little bit on edge, then we're a little more awake and we're a little more willing to grow. So sometimes, as I said, a leap just appears to happen, but it really begins with small steps. Probably the most famous quote with the word leap in it is by Neil Armstrong, right? When he landed on the moon and he said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." But the truth is that step, that leap that he took, was a culmination of thousands of small steps, right? I mean, technology had to be in a certain place for it to happen. There were thousands of people who worked together to create that moment. And interestingly enough, his words are sort of prophetic, because that moment did become a giant leap for humankind, because it was the first time that we were able to see the earth, right? It was actually the flight before that, but we were able to see the earth. And every single one of us in this room now can conjure up a picture of the earth, can't we? And it's changed our perception. Now, I don't think we've caught up to this image that we now hold, that we see that the earth is this living, breathing body, but it changed. There was a leap in consciousness that occurred in that moment. Now, I think a leap in consciousness, a leap can also be compared to an earthquake, right? Because when we have an earthquake, what happens? An earthquake seems like it just comes out of nowhere, doesn't it? It's like you're walking along and all of a sudden the earth starts shaking. By the way, I don't know how many of you noticed, but this floor moves. It sort of rolls. And the truth is this was built for earthquakes. So I always notice the Midwesterners notice it the first. They always come up to me and they go, do you know your floor is moving? Because, and you can feel it when people are walking, but it was built to be earthquake conscious. But what happens when there's an earthquake? The plates are rubbing against each other, right? The crust, and there's this tension that builds and builds and builds, and we can't see it, we can't feel it, we don't know what's happening, and then all of a sudden, we have this great earthquake. This tension is released. Did that ever happen to you in your life? You're kind of going along and you've got all this tension going, and all of a sudden, this leap happens in your life. And people are like, wait a minute, where did that come from? What happened? And what others may not have seen is this tension that's been building. When I was a kid, we never took a vacation. We never left town. I grew up in Chicago. And instead, when we would have a week off, my mom we would tour Chicago, which was a lot of fun. We'd go to the zoo or we'd go to the beach or the ball game, and that was our vacation. But there was a tension that was starting to build up in me, because the only places I'd ever been was, I got to go to Wisconsin for a week, like 3 times with my cousin, and then somewhere out in Illinois for a camp, and that was it. But feel that tension kind of building, and then this great leap takes place. John Borroughs said, take a leap and the net will appear. Haven't you found that when you take a leap, something magical begins to happen, where you find yourself in these new environments with new people and new experiences, and it calls upon us to bring forth parts of ourselves that we had not even known was there. Taking a leap requires faith. Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And Peter, the disciple, he represents faith in the New Testament. Anytime you see Peter, he represents faith. And the best faith story I know is where Jesus is walking on the water, and he says to Peter, he says, hey, come on out. So Peter, without thinking, I think he's the Aries in the group, Peter jumps into the water and he starts walking out toward Jesus. It's like, great. And then what happens? He sees Jesus, he's on his way out there, and then all of a sudden he stops and he looks around, and it's like, uh-oh, wait a minute. He sees the waves, he feels the wind, and he's like, what am I doing? And what happens to him? He starts to sink, he starts to drown, and he starts to go down. And as soon as he goes down, he reaches out his hand, and Jesus picks him up and says, oh, you of little faith. But really, he had a lot of faith, because at least he stepped out there. So when we look at this story metaphysically, what it represents is anytime we see Jesus, he represents the Christ consciousness that's within us, right? He represents the Buddha nature. He represents the Atman that's within us. And we are on this journey. We are heading toward that awakening. It is our divine birthright to awaken to the Christ nature, to awaken to the Buddha consciousness in our Buddha nature. And so we're heading toward that, and what happens? Sometimes we take our eye off the goal, we take our eye off the fatty foods that she could find. So there's a self-sabotage that happens. So why does that happen? Why do we self-sabotage when we see our goal to awakening, and then something gets in the way? So a study was done a couple of decades ago by a man named Bruce Alexander. And he was studying rats. They're always studying rats. And so the rats were in a cage, and they were giving the rats morphine. And of course, the rats were high all the time. It's great. It's wonderful. But he had this idea, and he thought, I wonder if the rats are bothered by being in the cage by themselves. And I wonder how they would be different if they could have some friends around them. So he built them like a rat pack spa. He built them this little cage, and it had nice wood chips, and it was real clean. It was great, and he put a few in there. And he had plain water for them to drink. and sugar water laced with morphine. And what he found was that when the rats were together, they went for the water. They didn't go for the morphine, they went for the water because they didn't need to numb themselves, right? They didn't need to dull themselves. So a woman by the name of Martha Beck writes about this whole idea and this concept of self-sabotage. And she says we have two sides to ourself. We have the animal self, and the animal self wants to eat, it wants to be cuddled, it wants joy and to have fun. And then we have our computer self that she calls it. And that's the part that says, okay, this is my goal, and this is how I'm going to get there. Now, what she says is that if we don't take care of the animal self will interfere and sabotage ourselves so that we can't get to the goal. For an example is the woman Rose, who's a vegan, but then she'd run off to the 7-Eleven. Or there was another woman named Anya, and she was great at her job. She was very efficient. She's a great worker, except when she had an important meeting. And then she would oversleep, and she would oversleep a lot. And so what Martha Beck discovered is that if we don't handle the animal self and the self-sabotage and speak to that directly, then it'll continue to happen. So it's not about, oh, I'm bad and awful that something happened, but rather asking questions. So what she found was that Rose would run off to the 7-Eleven because she was taking care of her elderly father and she was overwhelmed and not nurturing herself in other ways. What she found with Alyssa was that her animal self hated being in an office from 9 to 5 every day. And so her animal self was rebelling by sleeping in and missing appointments. And so she asked them both to look at different ways that they could handle these situations. And the thing that Alyssa came up with, or Anya came up with, was, what if I could work outside the office 1 or 2 days a week? And her boss said, okay, because she was so good. And guess what? She stopped missing those appointments. Rose began to take care of herself in different ways. And guess what? She limited the time she would run off to the 7-Eleven. In the late 70s, early 80s, I lived in a yoga ashram. And I ended up on staff in the summer. It was in the Bahamas because everybody went up to Canada to another ashram. And there were only about probably 6 or 8 of us on staff. And these 6 or 8 people, we were required to teach yoga classes, cook meals, clean the rooms, take bookings for rooms, lead chanting, all of it. And we had a schedule where we would be in different places. And this is 7 days a week because we were told, you don't take a day off from sadhana, you don't take a day off from God's work. Well, guess what would happen? A class was supposed to be taught and the teacher didn't show up. Oh, guess what? It's dinner time, and there's no dinner because the person who was supposed to cook wasn't there. Guess what? The laundry didn't get done. And so we had a meeting. We thought, what would happen if we each got 1 day off a week? You don't have to go to meditation if you don't want to. You can sleep. You can hang out at the beach all day. You can go down to the Holiday Inn and have breakfast. You can do whatever you want. And we found that once we instituted this, everybody showed up for everything that they were supposed to show up for. Because why? The animal self was being taken care of. The sabotage of the whole organization stopped because needs were getting met. So if you find that you are heading toward a goal, and the goal always, I think, is about awakening to Christ consciousness, to love, right? And you have something that you're doing that's stopping yourself, and it's something that's chronic that you're doing, stop and ask yourself, what's behind this behavior? Because you may be feeling caged, and so your animal self is rebelling, right? So that was one of the ways that she suggested that we begin to work with that. So again, a leap occurs when we take a lot of small steps. And sometimes as we're heading toward that Christ Buddha nature, sometimes it's a leap and we have this great awakening, but many times it is a small step. So in May, the Earth Care team asked us to write down our intentions about what we would do to change how we're showing up on this planet and how we can start to take care of it. How many of you were here in May and wrote those down and remembered? How many of you have done those things that you have written down on your intentions? Great. So I have the list, because we compiled the list, and there's 148 small steps here. 148 steps, small steps, not different steps, but just collectively. And I just highlighted a few. Pick up garbage at Lincoln Park. Take the bus more or walk. Compost more of my kitchen waste. Plant flowers in my yard. Plant herbs for the summer. Remember to use my reusable grocery bags. Establish a rain garden in my alley. No meat or eggs for 2 days a week. Use earth-friendly dry cleaners and cleaning products around my home. Grow tomatoes, carpool, install water barrels. You get the idea, right? Well, sometimes when we write these intentions, we forget about them. So you have a little piece of paper that is in your bulletin, and if it is not, and it may be the same things that you're already doing, it may be 3 different things. So I'm going to give you we still need some right here. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. If you would do that, just what actions, and we want actions, what actions can you take that will help heal the earth? You've heard some. What actions can you take to heal the earth? Something perhaps that you're not doing right now. And Earth Care team, what would you like them to do with these pieces of paper? Are you going to collect them or shall they take them home? Take them home. Put them on the refrigerator. Okay. So what you write down, we want you to take it home and put it on the refrigerator so that you can remind yourself of what your intentions are toward healing the earth. Remember that leaps in consciousness, that great leaps take many, many small steps, and that's what we're taking. So don't you think that we're ready for a great leap in consciousness? I think so, right? I mean, it's like, hello, come on, when are we going to wake up here? When are we going to head toward the Christ and stop sinking, stop falling? The truth is, we took a great leap in consciousness when we crawled out of the ocean and onto the land. We took a great leap in consciousness when we stood upright. We took a great leap in consciousness when we discovered fire. And we took a great leap in consciousness when we saw the earth for the first time. So I am doing, the way we're going to wrap this up is, because this is leap, I'm going to do a bit of a leap for me, kind of also going to the edge. Debbie Lee, if you would come forward. So about 2 weeks ago, Jan Campbell challenged me and all of Seattle Unity, actually, to the Als Ice Bucket Challenge. Yeah. And so I read the rules. So one of the rules is you're actually supposed to do it within 24 hours, which I didn't do because it's 2 weeks from now. And Debbie Lee is one of our board members, and she has agreed to do this with me because she has a first-hand account and a first-hand story that goes with this experience. So I am going to turn the microphone over to Debbie Lee, and she's going to tell us about her friend. So welcome, Debbie Lee.
Thank you. What was going to come next. And there was no cure, and it was very scary, and it was definitely terminal. And she considered assisted dying opportunities so that she wouldn't have to go through what was ahead. And our laws were such that that could not be done because she was no longer able to sign her own name to request it.
I don't want to get electrocuted. So leaps happen with small steps. And so this is a small step as we move toward awareness of ALS. We know there's so many other illnesses too that need to be. I invite you to do that, to listen to your heart and to move in that direction. So let me just look at my notes so we can wrap this up. A leap takes faith. And sometimes we don't have that faith ourselves, right? And one of the things that I noticed on the zip line was that the guys who were leading us, they knew what they were doing. And so I didn't have to rely on my own self to do what I was doing, but rather I trusted them implicitly. I leaned on their faith. And sometimes we need to lean on each other's faith to move forward. Yes, it's time for a leap in consciousness. So whether that tension is building in you for a big change or whether you're taking 1,000 small steps, know that we're all heading toward the same place, and that is to awakening, to walking toward the Buddha, to walking toward the Christ that dwells within each one of us. Have a great Sunday.